To those living in the shadows of the orphanage, it was proof that wealth had conspired to bury 47 deeper than any grave. The story begins on a fog-drenched October morning in 1839 when a farmer named Etienne Robideau made a discovery that would freeze the blood of every man and woman in St. Landry Parish. He had been driving his wagon along the dirt road that skirted the Louisiana, his horse shuffling nervous as the mist thickened around the cypress. Etienne knew this path well. It passed directly in front of the orphanage known as Maison de l'Ombre House. By daylight, the building looked harmless, a tall, weather-stained structure with iron gates, a chapel steeple, and a wide yard where children sometimes. But this morning, something was terribly wrong. The gate stood open, creaking back and forth in the wind, as though someone had kicked them wide in a hurry. The courtyard was empty. The air, usually broken by the chatter of children, carried only. Etienne dismounted and stepped closer. His boots sank into damp earth, and that was when he saw them. Dozens upon dozens of small, muddy footprints clustered near the gate, moving outward into the swamp. He followed them a short distance, his heart pounding faster with each step. The prints wandered in confused patterns, overlapping one another, before they simply stopped at the edge of the bog. No return tracks, no signs of adults, no indication of where the children had gone. Just an unnatural ending, as if the swamp had swallowed them whole. Alarmed, Etienne rushed into the orphanage itself. Inside, the dormitories were lined with neatly made beds, far too neat, as though someone had ordered the children to prepare them before leaving. The bowls of porridge on the dining tables had gone cold, uneaten, spoons resting inside. In room after room, same silent. Not a single child, not a single caretaker, not even a priest. By the time the villagers gathered at the scene, panic had already set in. Counting the beds and checking the parish registry revealed the unthinkable truth. 47 children had vanished overnight. No one in the nearby town had seen them leave. No wagon had traveled the road. No boats were reported stolen from the bayou dock. The disappearance was total, and it was immediate. The sheriff and his deputies tried to dismiss it, suggesting the children had run away into the swamp. But locals who knew the land shook their heads. A child might vanish into those waters, yes, but nearly 50. It was not flight, they insisted. It was a taking. Someone had taken. That morning marked the beginning of Louisiana's most chilling mystery. A building meant for sanctuary transformed into a void of horror, its empty halls echoing absent laughter. Etienne Robideau never forgot the sound of his own footsteps as he searched through the orphanage that day, the boards groaning beneath him like a coffin lid opening. He would later testify that he felt as though he were walking not through a house, but through a grave. And in a sense he was, for Maison de l'Ombre, the House of Shadows, had just claimed 47 lives in a single. To truly understand the terror of the Orphanage of Shadows, one must first step back into Louisiana as it was in 1839, a land caught between the old world and the new, between civilization and wilderness. It was a place where French Catholic traditions mingled uneasily with raw, untamed swamps, where every shadow carried a story whispered by enslaved men and women, and where the night seemed thicker than anywhere else in America. New Orleans had grown into a bustling port city, glittering with wealth, music, and sin, but just a few miles beyond its lights stretched endless miles of bayou country, a kingdom of moss and water that belonged to no man. In towns like St. Landry Parish, life was harsher, slower, and bound by superstition. People farmed the land, prayed for rain in the evening, and locked their doors, not just against thieves or wild animals, but against things the church itself struggled to name. The Catholic Church was the anchor of these communities, yet even the priests carried unease in their sermons. They warned against wandering too far into the swamps after dark, not because of alligators or snakes, but because of spirits. Les Revenants. Stories of wandering children taken by La Dame Blanche, the White Lady of the Bayou, had been passed down for generations, told in hushed voices around candle table. Parents would frighten their children with tales, saying, "If you do not stay close to the fire, the swamp will call your name." Whether they believed it or not, no one dared test those warnings. And it was here, in this landscape of half-Christian, half-pagan dread that the orphanage was built. The Maison de l'Ombre was meant to be a beacon of safety, constructed by French missionaries who wanted to shelter abandoned children of the parish, orphans of yellow fever epidemic, of shipwrecked sailors, of enslaved women who had died nameless in the fields. They all found themselves behind its. It was a place of prayers and strict discipline, where the children were taught to work, to kneel, to obey. By daylight, it might have looked like salvation, but by night, villagers swore that lanterns flickered in its upper windows when no one was in. Hunters returning late from swamp claimed they heard the children crying on the wind, even when the dormitory was silent. "That place is too close to the water," one old woman told her neighbor, and the water remembered. By 1839, Louisiana was already haunted, not just by ghosts, but by its own history. The scars of slavery, the violence of colonial wars, the epidemics that swept through towns, leaving streets littered with. All of these gave the land an air of To live there was carry death. And so when the children vanished from Maison de l'Ombre, people of St. Landry Parish did not think of kidnapper or of runaway wagon. No, their first thought was that the land itself had claimed them, that the swamp, hungry, had stretched out its fingers and pulled the orphans into its dark, endless. Maison de l'Ombre did not appear on parish land by accident. Its foundations were laid in 1827 by Father Matthias Duval, a French missionary whose arrival in Louisiana was itself wrapped in mystery. Some said he fled France after the Revolution, carrying with him relics and secrets he never spoke of. Others whispered that he had been expelled by his own order for practices that strayed too close to heresy. What is known for certain is that Father Duval chose the site with unsettling precision. He ignored offers of fertile farmland or safer ground near the church square, and instead marched into the swamp, declaring that the land by the cypress grove was where the Lord had guided him. To the villagers it seemed strange, even reckless, but who were they to question a man with money, raised from wealthy families eager to prove their piety? The orphanage was constructed, a tall, narrow building of gray stone with barred windows and a chapel's heart. From its earliest days, the orphanage carried a chill that could not be explained. Children whispered that they heard voices in the walls at night, murmurs in a language they did not know. Workers who had helped build the place swore that tools vanished when left alone, only to reappear buried in the mud the next morning. A carpenter claimed he saw a pale child staring at him from an upper window long before the dormitories were finished. When he ran upstairs to confront the prankster, he found the room empty. "Never again," he muttered, refusing to step foot inside. Even before the first orphan arrived, the building had earned its name, the House of Shadow. Yet the parish could not afford orphans plentiful and homes to keep them. The epidemics of yellow fever and cholera struck Louisiana with merciless rhythm, and every outbreak left dozens of children without family. The plantation economy cared nothing for the abandoned mixed-race children, the sons and daughters of dead sailors, the unwanted infant enslaved women. Father Duval's orphanage became their only refuge. By the mid-1830s, nearly 60 children lived within its walls at any given time. To outsiders, it seemed like a work of charity, but to the children themselves, life at Maison de l'Ombre was one of discipline, hunger. The rules were rigid. The children rose before dawn, pray, and their knees pressed into stone floors. Meals were small and plain, and misbehavior was punished with fasting. At night they were told to sleep with rosaries clutched in their hands, and to never, under any circumstances, look out the windows once the lantern. The swamp tempts the eyes, Father, and what soul? Older chill hallway. Footsteps sighed, breathing that wasn't quite. A soft humming traveled the dormitory singing. Still, the orphanage remained open, because fear could not outweigh. Villagers avoided it after dusk, crossing themselves. They joked in daylight the building was cursed, but at night their voices dropped. Many admitted would rather children grow hungry in the fields than sleep at roof. And so, Maison de l'Ombre developed a reputation, a place where charity and terror lived side by side, where the poor were fed but at the cost of something nameless. When the 47 children disappeared in 1839, the villagers were horrified, but they were not surprised. In their hearts, many admitted, the night before the children vanished, the parish seemed to hold its breath. The date was October 12, 1839, remembered not just in Louisiana, but later in whispered folklore across the South. It had been a restless day in St. Landry Parish. The weather, usually damp but predictable, had turned erratic. A sudden windstorm rattled shutter and bent the trees backward, though the skies remained cloudless. Farmers reported that their animals grew nervous and skittish. Horses refused to enter their stalls, while hounds howled and barked at nothing in particular. Even the bayou itself seemed disturbed, the water unusually rippling as though stirred from beneath. Inside the orphanage, the children sensed it too. Survivors from the village, children who once lived there but had since grown and left, later recalled that an unexplainable dread fell over the halls. The youngest cried without reason, clinging to one another. The older ones exchanged fearful glances. At supper, the candles flickered violently, though no draught touched the room. The bread served that night was said to taste bitter, and one girl swore she saw something dark swimming in her bowl of broth, though the priest scolded her for lying. Father Duval and the sisters prayed louder than usual in the chapel, their voices rising against the unease like a fragile shield. Outside, villagers claimed they saw lanterns moving back and forth in the upper windows long after the children should have been asleep. Etienne Robideau, the farmer who would discover the empty orphanage the next morning, told neighbors he passed by around midnight while driving home from a late errand. He described the sight as unnatural. Every window glowed with a dim yellow light, yet he heard no singing, no laughter, no sound at all. It looked, he laid, like a house full of candles with no one to hold. Another witness, a washerwoman named Camille, swore she heard the ringing of a bell from the chapel schedule. The bell tolled 3 times, each slower than the last, before the sound stopped dead. Strangest of all were the children's own words, fragments of testimony collected later from a handful of orphans who had once lived at Maison del Hombre. When the first rays of October's sun broke through the cypress canopy, it was Etienne Robideau's horse that sensed something was wrong. The animal snorted, refused to step closer to the gates of Maison de l'Ombre, stamping nervously. Etienne dismounted, expecting perhaps to find a stray dog or fallen bird. Instead, he saw the gates yawning open, their iron hinges screeching softly in the wind. It was unusual. The sisters who ran the orphanage were known for strict order. Those gates were always locked by nightfall, never left to swing loose like this. A chill tightened across his back. He stepped closer. He expected noise, children at play, a bell calling them to morning prayer, the shuffle of caretakers preparing breakfast. Instead, silent. A silence so deep that even the swamp beyond seemed muted. He walked into the courtyard, and that was he noticed dozens of small, fragile into the mud, leading from the dormitory. But the patterns were strange. They overlapped in a frenzied confusion, circling, scattering, as though the children had not walked in order, but rushed out together in chaos. Etienne followed them, his throat tightening, until he reached the swamp's edge. There the prince dissolved into black water. Not a single one returned. Heart pounding, he called out, "Father Duval!" His voice echoed against the stone walls, but no answer came. He ran inside. The dormitories lay in eerie order, rows of beds neatly made, blankets tucked in perfect folds, as if the children had been preparing for inspection. Yet on the tables in the dining hall, bowls of porridge sat untouched, their surfaces congealed into film. In the chapel, candles had burned low into puddles of wax, though no mass had been held at that hour. And everywhere, the same suffocating emptiness. No children, no sisters, no priests. The entire house stood hollow, as though abandoned in a single breath. By mid-morning, word had spread to the village. Men grabbed lanterns and rifles. Women clutched rosaries, and together swarmed the orphanage. Mothers who had lost children to fever fell to their knees, wailing, convinced that the earth had swallowed the orphan whole. The sheriff, or pale-faced, organized search. They combed the swamp in lines, calling names into the reed. Boats skimmed the bayou waters, poles probing beneath the surface. Dogs were brought to sniff out trails, but the hounds whined and refused to go near the black pools where the footprints ended. As hours stretched into evening, fear curdled into suspicion. Some accused Father Duval of leading the children into the swamp for some dark ritual. Others blamed escaped slaves, claiming they had raided the orphanage and carried the children away. Still others whispered of something far older, pointing at the cypress grove and muttering about revenants and swamp spirits. But in every theory, one fact remained constant. There were no bodies. 47 children and their caretakers had vanished into nothing. That night, lanterns burned in every house in St. Landry Parish. No one slept. Mothers clutched their children tighter. Fathers sat awake with shotguns resting across their knees. And all the while, Maison de l'Ombre loomed silent at swamp's edge, its windows black, its gates wide, as though daring someone to enter again. The House of Shadows had revealed its hunger. The following morning, Sheriff Amos Lebeau rode into the courtyard of Maison de l'Ombre with 6 deputies. A grizzled veteran of border skirmishes, Amos was not easily shaken, yet even he dismounted slowly, his jaw tightened as he surveyed the orphanage. The building looked the same as always, tall stone walls streaked with moss, wooden shutters rattling against the morning breeze. But to him, it seemed less like a refuge for children and more like a mausoleum waiting to be sealed. He ordered his men to spread out and search the grounds, but within minutes they returned with the same findings as the villagers the day before. Neat beds, untouched meals, no trace of life. The sheriff called for Father Duval, though he already knew the priest was missing. His voice echoed down the stone corridor. Nothing answered but the distant creak of rafters. Amos rubbed his temples, frustrated. People don't just vanish, he muttered. Yet 47 children had, along with the sisters who raised. He scrawled notes in his leather-bound journal, determined to impose reason on a scene that defied it. Possible abduction, possible mass flight into the swamp, possible. But as he wrote, each possibility seemed thinner than the last. By midday, the parish priest, Father Armand Belloc, arrived with a retinue of church officials. Unlike Duval, Father Belloc, strict, proud, and fiercely protective of the church's reputation. Standing before the villagers, he raised his hand, declaring that the disappearance was the work of satanic forces preying upon weak minds. He claimed the orphanage had been chosen as a battleground between heaven and hell, and that the faithful must not yield to fear. He sprinkled holy water across the dormitories, chanting Latin prayers, though his trembling voice betrayed more unease than conviction. The sheriff grew irritated. With respect, Father, he said sharply, we don't need prayers, we need answers. Where are those children? Did anyone see strangers near the swamp? Wagons, boats, anything? His deputies nodded, backing him, but the priest dismissed the questions with a wave. What you seek in earthly reason, Sheriff, will never be found. This is spiritual warfare. The crowd, caught between law and faith, turned restless. Some villagers sided with the sheriff, demanding patrols along the river and checkpoints on the road. Others clung to Belloc's words, convinced that demons had spirited the children away, and only relentless prayer could save them. Old women began muttering of loups-garous, swamp werewolves said to lure children with the voices of their dead parents. Young men whispered of les revenants, spirits of the drowned who rose to claim companions. That night, heated arguments filled the tavern. A farmer named Marcel slammed his fist on the table, insisting he had seen lights flickering deep in the swamp the night of the disappearance. Not lanterns, swore, but fire, green fire, that moved like it was alive. Another villager countered the orphanage had long been cursed, built on old ground where Choctaw children were buried before the French ever came. Fear fed rumor, and rumor became gospel. Meanwhile, Sheriff Lebeau ordered his men to drag the bayou, searching for bodies. For 3 days, boats pushed stagnant water, nets heavy with weeds and mud. They found bones of alligators, rusted tools, even the carcass of a cow, long drowned, but no trace of the orphan. Each fruitless search only deepened the sense of doom. Mothers wept openly in the street. Children clung to their fathers, refusing to sleep alone. By the end of the week, patience frayed. The sheriff accused the church of withholding knowledge about while Father Belloc accused hysteria. Villagers, desperate for leadership, found themselves torn between 2 men who offered no true answer. And through it all, Maison de l'Ombre remained still and silent, its doors open like a mouth waiting to swallow more. By the second week, with no bodies and no evidence, the parish was drowning in whispers. At first, they were murmured in corners, half-spoken as if the words themselves carried danger. But soon the rumors spilled into the streets, filling the silence left by the vanished children. People began to claim they had seen things the night of the disappearance. Shadows moving in the swamp, cloaked figures slipping through cypress trees, and lights that burned too steadily to be fireflies. A fisherman swore he heard chanting carried on the wind, low voices rising and falling in rhythm of any language he knew. When he repeated the sounds, old women gasped, crossing them, for they claimed the syllables resembled invocations summoned the dead. The first accusations fell on the church. Father Duval, already missing, became the perfect vessel suspicion. Some villagers whispered that he had not been a true priest at all, but a man who wore the collar only to conceal darker studies. His interest in the orphans, they said, had never been purely charitable. A woodcutter recalled catching Duval in the graveyard late at night, muttering prayers or unmarked grave. Another woman claimed she once saw him draw a chalk mark in the chapel, shapes that looked nothing. Father Belloc tried to smother these stories, calling them the work of Satan to turn us against each other, but his protest rang hollow. Then the tales grew bolder, more grotesque. In taverns, men whispered of old Catholic sects that had long ago broken away from Rome, sects that dabbled in forbidden rites, mixing scripture with pagan invocation. "Not every priest wears the cassock for Christ," muttered one. "Some wear it to hide blood on their hands." The idea spread quickly. Perhaps the children of Maison de l'Ombre had not been stolen, nor lost in the swamp, but offered up in sacrifice, to whom no one dared allow. A farmer's wife recalled how, weeks before the disappearance, fever had begun to creep through the parish. Crops had failed in animals birthed stillborn, and a strange edges of cornfield wondered if someone, desperate to save the village, had turned to older bargains. What if the children had been taken and offered to trade their innocence land? It was not the first whisper. In old Cajun folktales, there were stories of communities that fed the swamp to keep famine at bay, giving it animals first, and then, when the land grew truly hungry, children. Soon, everyone had a story of strange encounter. A man who saw footprints barn at dawn, though no children lived nearby. A midwife swore she found a doll nailed to her door. A hunter who returned from the swamp pale and trembling, saying he heard children laughing behind him, though he walked alone. Whether lies, hallucinations, or truths twisted by fear, each tale wove tighter the net of dread. By lamplight, mothers whispered to each other that perhaps the children were not dead at all. Perhaps they were still in the swamp, voices raised in eternal prayer, their little hands bound by some covenant signed in blood. Some villagers claimed they had dreamed of the children standing in rows, dressed in white gowns, their mouths open as if to sing. Yet sound came out. Others claimed they had seen the children's face in the black staring back up at them like. The sheriff dismissed these rumors as hysteria, but he could not deny one fact. More and more villagers refused to go near the orphan. At dusk, lanterns burned brightly in every home. Shutters were barred, and children were forbidden from stepping out. The swamp, once the lifeline of the community, became a thing avoided at all costs. And Maison de l'Ombre stood at its edge, dark and patient, a silent monument to the possibility that something unholy had taken place inside it. And so the question hung over St. Landry Parish like a curse. Had the children been stolen or sacrificed? The orphanage stood in silence after the disappearance, its windows boarded up, its chapel bell silenced by decree of the church. But there was one place the priests insisted no one enter: the basement. Heavy oak doors were nailed shut, iron crosses hammered into the frame, and a line of salt sprinkled across the stone threshold as if to bind something inside. The official word was simple, that the basement was unsafe, filled with rotting beams, damp stone that collapsed. Yet the villagers who lingered in the orphanage courtyard, staring at those locked doors, whispered of darker reason. Some swore that in the weeks before the children vanished, muffled sounds had come from below, scratching against wood, faint cries like those of children in fever dreamed once, a low murmur of chanting. Years later, curiosity proved stronger than fear. A group of local, emboldened, drink, anger that had ever been given, returned to the abandoned orphanage. One storm, they pried away the nailed their lanterns wild. The air that rushed out was foul, thick with the stench of decay and ash, as though the basement itself had been breathing in darkness for decades and was now exhaling. What they found in the hollow beneath the orphanage was nothing like the warnings of collapsing beam. The chamber was intact, its walls etched strange symbols that glowed faintly in the flicker of firelight. The carvings were not in French, Latin, or English. They belonged to no language the villagers knew. Jagged lines curling into shape, staring eyes, hand. Deeper in, beneath piles of charred wood, they uncovered bone. Some were blackened by fire, some still locked in rusted chains stretched from the stone wall. At first, they told themselves these were animal remains, perhaps cattle bones discarded during some forgotten use of the cellar. But the truth came in the smallest detail. The size of the skulls, too round, too fragile to belong to livestock, the tiny sockets where eyes had once been. They were not animal bones, they were children's bones, burnt, broken, bound. The discovery was so terrible that two of the intruders vomited on the floor, their lanterns trembling in their hand. The villagers fled the basement, slamming the door shut as though to keep the horror from following them. Yet in their haste, one man insisted he heard something still moving down there, a faint dragging as if chains were being pulled along stone. Another swore that in the moment their lantern light dimmed, he saw something crouched against the far wall, something too tall, too thin to be a man, its eyes glinting, wet. They never spoke of what they saw again, save in hurried whisper, where fear disguised it drunken. But from that night onward, no villager dared step within the orphanage's walls, and the sealed basement became more than rumor. It became legend. Parents told their children not to wander near the ruins, warning that the cries of the lost orphans still be heard below the earth in the wind. Hunters claimed their hounds refused to cross the threshold, howling and snapping as if they sensed something buried that the human eye could not. And when crops failed or sickness spread, the elders muttered that it was because the basement had been disturbed, that something once bound in chains had been given breath. Whether truth or drunken nightmare, the basement remained untouched, a wound in the ground that refused to heal, a graveyard of secrets that the church, and perhaps something far darker, wanted the world to forget. For decades, the mystery of the vanished children remained just that, a wound of unanswered questions, festering in the minds of the villagers and haunting the decaying skeleton of the orphanage itself. But time, as it often does, began to loosen tongues that had once been bound by fear. Nearly 20 years after that terrible night, two adults stepped forward, claiming that they had once been among the lost. At first, no one believed them. How could anyone have survived what was long considered a massacre, or worse, an erasure from existence? Yet, when they spoke, their words carried the kind of detail no liar could fabricate. The creak of the orphanage's stairwell, the way the air smelled of mildew after rain, the exact pattern of the iron crucifix nailed above the chapel door. These were the memories of those who had lived in. The first was a woman named Elise Moreau, her face weathered beyond her years, eyes hollow as though carrying shadows no daylight could burn away. She spoke of being a child of 7 when she was brought to the orphanage, left at the steps by parents too poor to feed her. Elise recalled that in the daylight hours, life seemed almost normal. Chores, meals of thin broth and hard bread, the strict but unremarkable discipline of. But everything changed when the sun went down. After nightfall, the orphans were roused from their beds and herded into the chapel, where the priest whispered prayers not from scripture, but from pages that reeked of smoke and age. She remembered the rhythmic chanting, the way the candlelight seemed to dim instead of brighten, and the terrible punishments for those who dared to cry or resist. Children were taken to the basement and never returned, their names forbidden from being spoken aloud. The second was a man named Baptiste Leclerc, gaunt and pale, who claimed to have been 10 years old at the time. Baptiste bore scars across his wrist, old circular welts that looked disturbingly like burn marks from iron shackle. He told of midnight gathering, where the children were forced to kneel in circles around symbols drawn in ash upon the floor. The priests demanded silence, demanded stillness, demanded absolute obedience, or else a child would be dragged away into the dark. Baptiste swore he could still hear the muffled sobs of those who were taken, echoing inside his skull. He described how, on the final night, the air had turned bitter cold, and every candle in the orphanage snuffed out, as though the building itself had stopped breathing. He remembered the priests shouting prayers that sounded more like curses, the ground trembling beneath their feet, and then nothing. Just darkness, press of many small bodies fleeing, and his own desperate escape through a broken window. What bound Elise and Baptiste's stories together was not only the horror but the implication. The children had not simply vanished by chance. Their disappearances were not the work of an accident, nor of some wild storm carrying them away into the swamp. These were orchestrated, deliberate acts, rituals performed under the guise of faith. Both survivors spoke of chain, fire, offering, and though their words contradicted the official silence of the church, they echoed the rumors long whispered in Suryanagar tavern and around its hearth that the children had been sacrificed, saved. The testimonies spread quickly, breathing new life into old fears. Some believed Baptiste entirely, insisting that the orphanage had been nothing more than a mass cultish practice carried out at clergy. Others accused them of madness, of conjuring nightmares to feed their hunger for attention. But no matter the stance, no one could ignore the way their accounts dovetailed with what had been found in the sealed basement: the chain, the bone, the carving. Too many coincidences for mere invention, too much detail for invention at all. And so the story of the Orphanage of Shadows transformed. It was no longer simply a tale of children who vanished to thin air, but of a carefully constructed deception of trusted holy men who may have struck bargains with something older and darker than God. If Elise and Baptiste were telling the truth, then the missing orphans were not victims of chance. They were chosen. And their absence was not the end of the story, but the beginning of something still still waiting in the ruins left behind. As the years dragged on and the orphanage sagged further into ruin, the legend of the vanished children spread far beyond Louisiana. Travelers, journalists, even wandering scholars came to Suryanagar to ask the same questions. The villager had whispered what truly happened on that in 18. But for every person seeking answers, there were a dozen conflicting stories, each more terrifying than the last. In time, 3 dominant theories took root, each clung to by those desperate to make sense of the inexplicable. Yet, smoke rising from a dying fire, none could be grasped and none could be proven. The first was the most pragmatic and perhaps the most damning. It was whispered that the children had not vanished at all, but had been sold, traded away by men of God who had disguised greed as piety. Louisiana in those years was a land steeped in slavery, and children, especially those without families, were a profitable commodity. According to this theory, the priests struck secret deals with traffickers, loading the children onto wagons under the cover of night and sending them away to distant plantation, foreign market. Some even claim to have seen small figures marched in chains toward the dock, though no records of sales or shiploads ever confirmed it. To those who believed this version, the story was not one of ghosts or curses, but of human cruelty, masked by the church's silence and protected by its power. The second theory was darker, less grounded in commerce and more in fear of the unseen. It proposed that the children had been taken not by slavers, but by their own caretaker, offered as sacrifices in rituals older than Christianity itself. Here, the rumors of hooded figures in the swamp and the testimonies of Elise and Baptiste found fertile soil. Believers of this theory spoke of blood spilled upon stone altars, of chants whispered in forgotten tongues, of desperate bargains made with forces that promised protection from famine and plague in exchange for innocence. The strange carvings in the basement, the burnt bones, the chains, each detail became proof of something sinister, a ritual gone either horribly wrong or frighteningly right. If this was true, then the children had not been taken away at all. Their souls had been swallowed by whatever darkness the priests had in, their voices forever echoing beneath the floorboards of the orphanage. The third theory carried with it cruel simplicity, yet it was no less horrifying. Some claimed that the children had been led into the swamp itself, perhaps a trusted hand, perhaps by the force of hysteria or suggestion. In this telling, they wandered into the small feet down by mud, cries lost, calls of owl, hum of insect. The swamp was vast, treacherous, and unforgiving. A group of 47 children could vanish there without leaving a single trace, their bones swallowed by the waters, their names dissolved into silence. This explanation comforted some, for it offered an ending rooted not in evil, but in tragedy, an accident, a misstep, a mass drowning hidden by the swamp's endless appetite. Yet it also raised a question no one could answer. Who led them there, and why did no one return? Each theory clashed with the others. Each carried enough fragments of truth to seem possible, and yet each fell apart under no evidence, records of no sightings of the children in distant plant. The rituals, if real, left behind only ashes and symbols no scholar could translate. And the swamp, when searched, yielded nothing but frogs and the glimmer of water. Theories filled the air like gnats, buzzing endless, feeding on grief but offering no resolution. The villagers argued, outsiders speculated, and still the orphanage loomed as silent as a grave, its walls unwilling to answer the questions that tormented every generation. Perhaps that was the cruelest part of the mystery, that after all the whisper, testimonies, and the evidence, both mundane and supernatural, the truth remained as unreachable as the cries said to echo from the basement. Theories gave comfort, theories gave fear, but theories never gave closure. The Orphanage of Shadows kept its secrets, and the children remained lost, suspended between the realms of the living, the dead, and the forgotten. If the orphanage itself was scar, then the swamp that surrounded Suryanagar was the festering wound. Over time, the villagers came to believe that the truth of the vanished children was not buried beneath stone floor hidden in ledger, but dissolved into the mist and waters of the bayou. Long after the last priest fled and the orphanage crumbled into rot, the swamp remained alive with whispers. On certain nights, always when the air was heavy and the mist hung low, locals claimed to hear voices drifting across the water. Thin, high-pitched voices, not unlike children singing lullabies, though the words were always indistinct, stretched and warped, as if carried by currents older than time. Mothers clutched their babies tighter on those, refusing to let them sleep alone, for fear that the swamp's call would draw them out into the dark. Fishermen told darker. Some swore that as dawn broke, the fog rolled back to reveal the black waters. They had seen small figures gathered at the tree line, pale shapes taller than a child, standing perfectly still, their heads tilted as if listening to something only. The fishermen said these figures would linger until the first ray of sun touched the swamp, and then they would scatter into the mist like smoke. Others claimed to have seen hands, thin, white hands, breaking the surface of the water, reaching upward before sinking once more, as though trying to claw their way back to air. Few dared fish near the orphanage ruins, and those who did often returned with nets torn, hooks missing, or worse, nothing at all, as if the swamp demanded tribute for every As the stories spread, a belief grew among the elders that the swamp itself had taken the children. It was not priests, nor slavers, nor ritual, but the land, the endless swallowing wetland that encircled them a living. Some said the swamp was hungry, its waters cursed by ancient blood spilled long before the orphanage were built. Others whispered that it was children's souls that became fused into root, mud, and mist so that they might never leave the place of their suffering. According to this belief, every frog's croak, every rustle in the reeds, every ripple across the still black water was the echo of a lost orphan trapped forever in the bayous. Parents used these legend warnings. Children were told never to wander to a tree line, lest the voices call their name. If you hear laughter in the mist, do not answer, for it is not laughter at all. It is the swamp asking for another. Teenagers dared each other to spend nights at the edge of the wall, but few lasted until dawn. Those who did often returned pale, shaken, and unwilling to speak of what they had seen or heard. The swamp had a way of stealing words from the tongue, the same way it stole children from the world. As the decades passed, the legends grew with every retelling, woven into the fabric of Suryanagar itself. The swamp was no longer just a place of reeds and water. It was alive and hungry, and whether it had taken the children by force or whether the children had become part of it, no one could say. But one truth remained certain among the villagers. The swamp did not, and neither, it seemed, did the voices that whispered from its depth. The tragedy of the orphanage might have become the subject of formal investigation, the kind that leaves trails of ink and signatures for future generations to dissect, had the officials of Louisiana chosen transparency. But instead, the opposite occurred. Within days of the disappearance, men in black coats and polished boots arrived in Suryanagar, speaking not to grieving families or bewildered villagers, but only to the parish priests and landowners. They carried with them papers, seals, and the kind of authority that smothers questions before they are asked. What followed was not an inquiry, but a quiet burial. The official statement, printed in a few scattered newspapers, was curt, dismissive. The children had run away. Desperate for freedom, emboldened by numbers, they had fled into the night. No evidence was offered to support this claim. No effort was made to explain how 47 children, some barely old enough to walk, could vanish en masse, traced. The notion rang hollow even to outsiders, but to the villagers it was an erasure of their grief, silencing of their suspicion. Runaways became the label pasted over an atrocity, the word repeated like a charm to ward off curiosity. When concerned citizens sought the truth in parish records, they found only documents that should have existed, orphan placement, baptismal certificates had vanished. Some were said to have been misplaced in floods, others claimed to have been lost in fire, but many whispered that no such accidents had occurred. The archives had been deliberately emptied, their pages torn out like weeds before they could take root. Priests who once spoke of their wards grew evasive, insisting that the children had been transferred elsewhere, though no parish in the state. The story had been cut, pruned, and erased until it no longer resembled truth at all. The villagers, however, were not so easily silent. They began to whisper of gold exchanged in hidden rooms, of hands shaken behind closed doors. Plantation owners, wealthy and powerful, were said to have demanded silence. After all, the rumor of child trafficking was not only plausible, but profitable, in a land where bodies were bought and sold with impunity. To admit that priests had been complicit or that local elites had turned a blind eye would have been to threaten the social order, to poison the very foundation upon which Louisiana's wealth was built. Better to bury the truth beneath bureaucracy, better to call the vanished runaways than to admit they had been stolen, sacrificed, or consumed. Whispers persisted that the officials themselves profited from the cover-up, that the investigators who arrived in Suryanagar did not seek justice but ensured silence, carrying purses heavy with coin by the time. The speed with which the case was closed only deepened suspicion. No witness searches swamp beyond a glance, no exhumations of the orphanage basement, despite villagers begging for. To the world outside, the disappearance was filed unremarkable. To those who lived in the shadow of the orphanage, it was proof that wealth and power had conspired to bury 47 souls deeper than any grave could. Over time, the cover-up itself became part of the legend. When children in Suryanagar asked their elders why the world did not come to save the orphan, why no one wrote their names in books or carved them into stone, the elders would sigh and say, because the rich bought their silence and the church sold its soul. In this way, the crime was not only against the orphan, but against memory itself. What had been done to them was not only physical, but historical. Their existence scrubbed away, their cries stifled beneath the weight of golden ink. And so the orphanage stood not merely as a house of shadows, but as a monument to corruption, a reminder that sometimes the most terrifying monsters are not found in the swamp or the dark, but in the velvet-draped rooms where silence is and justice sold. Time has a way of softening memory, but it does not erase soil's testimony. For decades, the story of the 47 vanished children drifted like smoke through the bayou, more rumor than record, a tale told by grandmothers to keep children from wandering too close to the swamp. Yet, in the middle of the 20th century, when the ruins of the orphanage had long since been swallowed by vines and moss, the ground itself began to give up its secret. Local hunters were the first to stumble upon it. In the winter of 1957, after rare dry season lowered the swamp's waterline, one hunter's boot struck something that was neither stone nor wood. Brittle, digging with the butt of his rifle, he unearthed bones, small, delicate, unmistakable. Soon others were found, scattered shallowly beneath the mud, as if someone had been in a hurry to bury them. For every bone uncovered, the old whispers grew louder, their weight pressing once again on the community like a curse that refused to die. News spread quickly, and with it came curiosity and amateur historians. Some called themselves explorers, others claimed to be researchers, but all were drawn to the swamp by the lure of forgotten horror. What they uncovered in the following years was far darker than anyone had expected. Not just bones, but artifacts, objects buried and preserved, bogs' peculiar chemistry, rosary beads blackened with age, small wooden crosses, and fragments of priestly vestments surfaced from the muck. But alongside them were items that had no place in Christian ritual. Crude wooden idols, exaggerated circles carved into stone, bones etched with symbols more pagan than Catholic. The juxtaposition baffled many, but terrified the locals. To the devout, it was proof the church had not merely failed to protect the orphan, but had led them into forbidden rites. A blending of rosaries and runes, of crosses, crude idols, suggested not a clash of belief systems, but a deliberate fusion, a secret cult wearing the mask of Christian. Some of the carvings bore uncanny resemblance to the ritual symbols of voodoo, though distorted in ways practitioners would later call perversion. Others were runic marks no European priest in 1839 should have known. How had such disparate beliefs come together in a single, sinister place? Even more unsettling was the pattern in which the remains were found. The shallow graves did not sprawl randomly through the swamp. They formed circles, interlocking and precise, as if the children had been laid down not in panic, but in ritual order. Many skulls bore strange burns along the temples. Blackened patches suggested fire had kissed them before burial. Some bones were fused with ash, fragments of iron chain, as if the children had been bound and burned in ceremonies whose purpose no one dared. When the discoveries were brought to light, authorities once again dismissed. The official explanation was that these were simply victims of disease, hastily buried in the swamp in an attempt to halt the spread of fever. But to those who saw the bones with their own eye, to those who traced the carvings with trembling fingers, such words rang hollow. Disease does not carve pagan symbols into bone. Fever does not align graves in perfect circles. Illness does not bind children in chains and leave rosaries blackened by unnatural fire. The most chilling find came in 1962 when a group of college students conducting an unofficial excavation uncovered a stone slab buried beneath 2 feet of mud. Its surface was etched with intersecting circles and Latin inscriptions, but also symbols that scholars would later describe as heretical amalgamations, the kind of writing found in grimoires long condemned by both church and state. At the center of the slab was a single word, carved deeply enough to resist erosion: sacrificium, sacrifice. After this discovery, the swamp fell quiet once more. The state sealed off the area, claiming preservation, but locals whispered of a cover-up reborn. Bones and artifacts were boxed, labeled, and spirited away to archives where they would never again see light. To this day, no museum in Louisiana displays them. No scholar cites them in academic. It is as if the swamp tried to speak, only to be silenced once again. And so, the discoveries did not bring closure. They only deepened the horror, adding flesh to the bones of rumor. Where once there had been whispers of vanishing, there was now evidence. The Orphanage of Shadows had not been an accident, not a fever, not a runaway tale. It had been a ritual, organized and executed with sacrifice hidden beneath the mask of faith, buried in mud, and remembered only by the cries that still echo through the cypress on nights when the fog is thick enough. For generations, the land where the orphanage once stood remained untouched, as if marked by an unseen curse. No farmer dared to plow the soil, and no builder laid a foundation. The place became woven into Louisiana's folklore, a tale told around firesides and whispered in schoolyards. And so the question remains, unanswered after more than a century. Where did the 47 children go? No bodies to bury, no records to trace, no justice to deliver, just silence, layered over whispers, layered over fear. Today the swamp has swallowed the orphanage, but the story lingers like a wound that never heals. They say if you walk the bayou on an October night, when the mist clings low to the water, you may still hear the faint sound of children crying, but you will never see them.